So good evening and welcome to everyone to Colin Soskolne's talk on how science is misused in support of dominant interests. And I just want to say a few words about Colin so that we all know who will be speaking and on what authority he's speaking tonight. So Colin was born and grew up in Johannesburg, South Africa, and he lived during the height of, grew up here during the height of apartheid. So Colin had first-hand exposure to the social injustices in South Africa, which left a lasting impact on his life course. After obtaining his BSc in 1970 and honors in 1971, and these were obtained at the University of the Witwatersrand in Johannesburg, Colin worked successively for the South African Human Sciences Research Council and then later for the Medical Research Council. So having obtained research and teaching fellowships, Colin went on to obtain his PhD in epidemiology, and this was obtained from the University of Pennsylvania in 1982. Colin's doctoral dissertation was award-winning, and in 1991, this led to the International Agency for Research on Cancer designating occupational exposures to strong inorganic acid mists contained in sulfuric acid. I'm just admitting Mark as I'm introducing Colin. So just to carry on, so I just want to repeat that because I was distracted letting Mark in. So his doctoral dissertation led to the International Agency for Research on Cancer designating occupational exposures to strong inorganic acid mists containing sulfuric acid as a definitive human carcinogen. While extending his doctoral work post-PhD at the Ontario Cancer Care Centre and the University of Toronto between 1982 and 1985, Colin's academic career included research on HIV/AIDS, as well as education. He subsequently relocated to the University of Alberta in 1985, where his interests expanded to include environmental health more broadly, and then global change with ethics and philosophy paralleling each line of inquiry. Colin pioneered the development of ethics guidelines for the profession of epidemiology, which was published in 1996 and adopted by the International Society of Environmental Epidemiology in 1999. Having witnessed injustice as a youth in South Africa, and with the corrosive influence of powerful interests in science and public policy along the way, Colin recognized the even greater need for an ethical world, overcoming, with the support of key colleagues, much opposition in moving his ethics promoting initiatives forward. After 28 years at the University of Alberta, Colin retired as Professor Emeritus in 2013. He continued with 8 years of intense voluntary service, pursuing in leadership roles the International Network for Epidemiology in policy's mission of integrity, ethics, and evidence. If you'd like to have more information about the work that Colin does, you can of course go onto his website, and if you want to note it down, it's www.colinsoskolne.com. So thank you very much, and without any further ado, I'm going to hand over to Colin. Thank you, Colin, for coming to share with us tonight your knowledge and wisdom. Thank you.
Thanks. It's my pleasure and honor, Jolene, to share anything that you're moving forwards with in social justice issues. So thank you. I cannot see any of you, so I can't tell your reactions. When I'm done with my presentation after about 50 minutes, we will have at least 30 minutes for questions and answers and discussion. And please feel free to use the chat box on your Zoom as one of the Zoom functions. And I think Jolene or Michael will be monitoring that, and I'll also look at it when we get to that point. But as I say, I can't see you, so forgive me for not responding to whether you're looking puzzled or however you might be responding to what I'm saying. So the topic for today is science is misused in support of dominant interests, how and why. When Jolene sent the reminder around with the link, she left out the miss, but that's very interesting in terms of dominant paradigms and perceptions of how things move in the world in which we live. I cannot use my cursor with this, so I'm just going to change slides. Slide
That's
number
perfect.
2.
Thank you.
Great. Okay. So just to remind people who have had the stamina and interest to participate in this whole series from the beginning, the series started on September the 5th. And you've seen the series topic, which was mentioned at the bottom here: could human misery in the world be reduced by breaking the chains of repression and revenge? That's the series theme. And the first talk was The Transatlantic Slave Trade by Tony Gorton. We were very fortunate to have Kathleen Mahoney on ending the cycles of repression and revenge in Canada. She was very much instrumental in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in Canada. And we were fortunate too to have all of these speakers: Mark McCormack on Hegel, From the Slaughter Bench of History to Blessedness. Jolene Young herself spoke last week on historical and intergenerational trauma in South Africa. Today I'll be speaking. Next week, Sunday, same time, former Robben Island prisoner Lionel Davis will speak and discuss forgiveness. And then we're going to wrap up the series with as many of these speakers participating in the panel as possible to talk about what we've learned and to what end. I am also grateful to Sandy Shell, whose inspiration really led to this series. Michael Power, Jolene, and I then put the series together. And I hope for those of you that have participated, you've learned something, or as much as what I at least have learned and continue to learn from this. So when Jolene spoke last week, I mentioned in the Q&A, since I was moderating her session, that she had made this important distinction. When we think of slavery in the Western Cape, we think of Holland, the Netherlands, the Dutch. But in fact, she nicely pointed out that it wasn't them at all. It was the Dutch East India Company, a business, or what today might be called a corporate interest. And with that important point, I will be expanding on the business and financial influence in science and how it serves dominant interests, how it can be misused to serve dominant interests. Jolene gave you my website link. This whole PowerPoint presentation, which has live links throughout it, will be posted within the next 24 hours. It's not quite there yet. I only just finished it before coming on air now. So it'll go up on my website shortly. So you will be able to go and review everything I'm saying to you here. And I believe it is being recorded as well. But the main thing is to be able to access the primary sources through the hot links that are embedded throughout the publication. Now, what do I mean by dominant interests that were in the title of this talk, or dominant paradigms? I want to give you a couple of examples. Those of us that are old enough to remember the so-called Vietnam War might be shocked, I shouldn't say will be, but might be shocked to hear it being called the American War. I've spent some time in Vietnam on conferences, and it's very interesting. When you're there, they talk about it as the American War. But this just shows you the dominant, the paradigm that we have in the West is that it was a Vietnam War, caused implication being that it's their problem and that's their fault, whereas from their point of view, it's seen in the reverse. I also want to give another example for the South Africans or people with a South African background. If you think of the late Nelson Mandela, at one time he was considered a terrorist under the then dominant paradigm of nationalist apartheid government, and then only was seen later as a freedom fighter. Perhaps people with insight saw him as a freedom fighter all the way along and didn't buy into that dominant paradigm. So dominant forces then create the narratives or the storylines by which we live and act out our lives, and in the name of which we actually die. Some of us will die for these beliefs in these storylines that we're trained to buy into or get insight to believe that is the truth in some way. So just to bring us all onto the same page of what I mean when I talk about dominant paradigms, and it'll link into dominant interests. Now, I've had the good fortune of working since 2017 with a colleague, Ian Panton, who is a remarkably helpful resource and has been an amazing resource of significant quotes and reference material. The man ought to have been a librarian with his ability to retrieve materials of relevance. And the quotes and materials that he retrieves from his archives has demonstrated over time their truthfulness, their veracity. So when they were released or issued under those prevailing paradigms at the time, I'm sure they must have been very inconvenient truths. This week, Ian reminded me of the following quotes over the next 3 or 4 slides that I want to give to you because they set the context very nicely. And they are indeed appropriate to what I'm going to tell you and do set the stage for this webinar today. I want to acknowledge Ian, who's been so supportive and encouraging of my work, as I mentioned, since I met him in 2017 at a conference in London, England. So this is the first quote from and reference and hot link that Ian Panton sent me. It's from the late Michael Meacher. Many of you who have British ties will remember that Michael Meacher, I think, was a Labour politician for something like 45 years before he died, I think, in 2015. So all of these people that Michael's quoting are credible sources. They're not people who've just, in the modern period of social media, might take a whim to say something and want it to be seen as truth. These are very credible people in each of these slides that are following, well, throughout this production, wherever I give you references. So Michael Meacher was asked to write the foreword to a book by Jeffrey Smith, which came out in 2004, called Seeds of Deception, Exposing Corporate and Government Lies About the Safety of Genetically Engineered Food. And the quote is, with a hot link to the full article, for those who still believe the constitutional fantasy that governments act in accordance with their manifesto in the general interests of society, this book will come as a shocker. The exercise of power today is much more hard-nosed and ruthless, and the power brokers are not the electorate, but big business. Sorry, I'm just getting some links here. Some calls from people. Okay, Mark, I'm hearing you. I hope you can stay with us through the Q&A period. The next quote that I want to give from that Ian provided to me yesterday and today is from Evangelos Violanatos, which appeared in the Huff Post. This is an historian and environmental strategist on the topic of annihilating the natural world. This came out in 2017. A successful business strategy of global corporations is to buy politicians and scientists to legitimize and protect their products. Second, they maintain political dominance at home and abroad by keeping the world in turmoil. They do that by bribing politicians who globalize corporate economic and consumption models and fight wars for petroleum and other resources. The tobacco industry became the paradigm for covering up the harm of their product by recruiting Hollywood, the media, lobbyists, and advertisers. Lobbyists purchased federal and state politicians. The chemical industry even outsmarted the tobacco companies. Its lobbyists and scientists drafted the laws regulating, so to speak, petrochemicals and other synthetic chemicals. The result is that chemical companies test their own products. There were 3 wonderful hot links here to Errol Morris commenting on objective truth. These are YouTube videos. Some are a bit longer than others. The bottom one is just 3 minutes long. Michael Sheen, many of you may know him as a Shakespearean actor from Wales. He's a Welsh, very internationally renowned actor and Hollywood and other performer. And he speaks on pulling together in a remarkable talk that he gives. And it was through Ian introducing me to Michael Sheen when I contacted Michael Sheen's publicist at the time, and Michael Sheen then endorsed the International Network for Epidemiology and Policy. So in addition to his acting, he takes a profound active interest in advocating for environmental justice issues. Is quite an amazing individual with his amazing talents as well. The Welsh, again, back to Wales, so the Welsh voices on A New World Beginning from Les Miserables, the film or the play. And that's well worth listening to. Stunning sorry, my French is coming out here. I'm studying French and now I can only speak in French. But anyway, I hope it's making sense. The text of the lyrics of the song are quite wonderful in terms of change and environmental justice as well. And that's just 3 minutes long. Now, to go back to the typical quotes that I've published several times over since I got involved in this topic in the early 1980s. This is one by Clayson and Halpin. This is more directly related to my field, which is epidemiology. I'll come to that in just a moment, what that really is, and public health and its role in public health and public health policy formulation. So Clayson and Halpin, way back in 1983, said in a paper that they published, industry's offensive against the regulation of health and safety hazards uses academics to downplay or deny the seriousness of the hazards. And you can see the connection between this and the quotes that Ian sent me. And he didn't send me those quotes because he had seen what I was going to tell you, but he sent them because I indicated what I was interested in. For those of you that attended seminars on this platform earlier this year, you might have seen a few of these slides. I apologize for overlap, but they do make for a coherent whole in the storyline of what I'm telling you. This book by Broad and Wade from 1983 is entitled Betrayers of the Truth, and the subtitle is Fraud and Deceit in the Halls of Science, to just make the point here that it's not just confined to industry doing malevolent things, but it goes way beyond that. And it goes way back to Galileo and many more. It's not just a recent phenomenon. Broad and Wade argue that, and this is a quote, the conventional wisdom of science being a strictly logical process with objectivity, the essence of the scientist's attitude, errors being speedily corrected by rigorous peer scrutiny and replication, is a mythical ideal. So we have this narrative view that science is the pursuit of truth and that whatever scientists say, you can trust. Well, what I'm showing you is that that is not necessarily so. There are several books on the topic by highly reputable people, one of which I'll show you has been turned into a docudrama in 2015, others of which have been recognized internationally for their contributions. The one that politicized me as to the need for advocacy in this area from 1978 is by Sam Epstein from the University of Chicago, I believe at the time, on the politics of cancer. And Deborah Davis produced 3 books in 2002, 2007, 2010. You can see the titles there. Tales of Environmental Deception, The Secret History of the War on Cancer, and her work is seminal on cell phone radiation and health effects. David Michaels was under the Obama administration for the head of the Occupational Health and Safety Administration from the University of George Washington University in the States, and a close colleague of mine, published a book in 2008, Doubt is Their Product, How Industry's Assault on Science is Harmful to Your Health, and then his most recent book, The Triumph of Dark Money and the Science of Deception. On the very specialized topic of asbestos, McCulloch and Tweedale defending the indefensible. Now, why was all of this exposed? Because what these works do is they manufacture doubt, and by casting doubt and fomenting uncertainty, they therefore confuse the public, and certainly they confuse health policy makers who are not trained enough, let alone being scientists themselves, to navigate through what is good science and what is malevolent or ill-intended science. And the role of the policymaker is thereby undermined. And it's essentially it results in the subversion and ambushing of science. I mentioned this 2015 movie. This was by Oreskes and Conway, Merchants of Doubt, how a handful of scientists, in quotation marks I point out, obscured the truth on issues from tobacco smoke to global warming. Now, epidemiology in brief, it's a population health science. We study the distribution, that is where you find diseases occurring in population groups, and determinants or the causes of these diseases in these communities. We tend to study diseases where they arise. Epidemiology is critical to rational public health policy formulation. It's an applied science. The knowledge derived from epidemiological evidence is not used solely for discovery purposes so that the epidemiologist can get a master's or a PhD degree, but to impact public health policy. It is also applied to control and prevent health problems and is used to restore, promote, and protect population health across all levels of society. So by virtue of the focus of epidemiologists on protecting the public's health, as a profession, they are expected to serve the public with the public interest trumping all other interests. Remember, we live in a world of competing interests. Now, we expect, as I mentioned earlier, that scientists have integrity, that they will be true to the discipline, and that they will pursue the truth. And when we think in terms of research integrity, this is different from engineering integrity, where if you build a building, you assume it's going to have integrity, structural integrity, it's going to stand up. Well, you have moral integrity from a religious viewpoint, but you also have research integrity that the science is going to hold up. And we have its implications for health policy and for the advancement of science. We make assumptions when we read science that the science is used to inform policy. I'm talking about these epidemiology as a public health science, and epidemiologists are expected to operate with integrity in the application of the scientific method. But if the scientist lacks integrity, what then is produced to inform rational policy? Distorted science undermines health policy and derails the advancement of science. Because of these problems, I became very involved when it was founded in 2006. I became directly involved in 2007 for its first meetings. It was then called the Joint Policy Committee of the Societies of Epidemiology, and it evolved into the International Network for Epidemiology Policy. So since 2007 until just a few months ago, I was very involved. As most of you know, I'm retiring and I have resigned from any role in this organization as of late. This organization's watchwords are integrity, equity, and evidence in policies impacting health. And INEP works at the interface of research and policy to maintain and protect the public's health. And it does this by several different ways, but the three that I want to mention, but the green one being the focus of this talk, it creates and disseminates evidence-based knowledge about epidemiology. It supports capacity building of experts to translate research and science into policy, and it recognizes and highlights the misuse of data and potential corruption of the science practiced by epidemiologists. With this organization in 2014, I was the chair of the organization for a few years at the time and led its development committee, and it was a vice chair and a former chair-elect. So I've been in leadership roles in the organization for some time. And in 2014, identified this topic of conflict of interest and the need for disclosure in epidemiology. Some of you would know, and particularly Manji and his sister who were visiting me when I was in Cape Town, I was working on this document. I resurrected it in 2019, it was 2019. Then I had to leave South Africa early to return because of COVID. And then with the lockdown, I took it upon myself to try to bring all the work that I had started to closure so that I really could think of retiring and immersing myself in other things that had been put on the back burner for decades. So this document ended up getting done between late 2019 through 2020, and on January the 5th, 2021, and there's a hot link to the document, it was launched by the International Network for Epidemiology and Policy. So I mentioned it was started in 2014. It was led by myself with 9 co-authors, 8 or more contributors, as well as 6 external reviewers. It was adapted from work of several professional organizations. It was unanimously approved by the network's board on September the 16th in 2020. And then it went ahead and exceeded its required member organization endorsements according to the INEP bylaws. They have a threshold requirement, and on December 24th, it's exceeded that, and it was released, as I said, in January. Now, why conflict of interest? In relation to everything else that you've heard up to this point, what is conflict of interest? Well, if a scientist has a vested interest how truth is presented, they can distort the truth. And you can do this particularly readily in applied sciences, I would dare say more easily than you can in the basic sciences. And epidemiology is very much an applied science. And the scientist with a conflict of interest may have her or his objectivity compromised. And you get that compromised by being bought and manipulated by powerful interests. So you find yourself being seduced by what money can buy. And what drives it? Well, a scientist's vested interests could drive it. And this could include benefiting financially, promotions within whatever system they work in, whether it's academia or corporate or government, prestige, and other things. Bias and uncertainty can be properly managed scientifically, but what happens when investigator bias is at play? Conflict of interest introduces a human element into how science is applied. It can impact all aspects of scientific inquiry, from the very framing of a scientific question to how we design the studies, how we analyze the studies, the methods of biostatistical analysis that we use to do the analysis, how we interpret the work, and ultimately the dissemination of a study. If a study shows something that's an inconvenient truth, pressures can be put on the scientist to suppress the science so that it doesn't see the light of day and gain public attention or policymaker attention. So INEP's position statement provides a very practical approach to managing conflict of interest. Its guidance is recognized as being needed for science to remain credible. How do conflict of interest practices affect epidemiology? Well, rather than doing an impartial analysis, an objective analysis, seeking truth, scientists can produce and disseminate misinformation, or, as I alluded to a moment ago, suppress data. The association between cause and effect can be obscured and denied. You saw all those books I mentioned by Deborah Davis and David Michaels and others. Scientific integrity can be undermined. Public trust in the science of epidemiology can be eroded. Workers, the public, and the environment can be harmed. Distorted science undermines health policy, and worst of all, it derails the advancement of science. And science predominantly is a public enterprise, and fortunes of tax dollars go into supporting it. So when it's undermined, it's costing everybody, not just in terms of, when we're talking public health, their health, but also in terms of knowledge and the advancement of that knowledge. What's in the INEP position statement? Well, you know the title already, Conflict of Interest and Disclosure in Epidemiology. So it's a 95-page document, but the actual essence of the document is only about 31 pages. And you can navigate your way around it if you can just expect to see some recent high-profile cases that exemplify the misuse of epidemiology in the recent past. But if we don't look at some of the past examples, well, then we're just destined to repeat the history. So this also looks, as you'll see, at some of the recent stuff alluded to in the quotes earlier, like tobacco, asbestos, and so on, which have been going on since 1952. There's also some recent conflict of interest examples developed by some of the International Network on Epidemiology and Policy co-authors and the contributors. There's a compendium of common practices used to distort and misapply the science. And the recommendations, ultimately, the bottom line of the document is that we need to take this very seriously. And the way to do it is to recognize and identify that there is a problem. Once we can recognize that there is a problem, avoid it, If you have no way of avoiding it and your expertise is so needed where you serve on a committee, whether it's a scientific advisory group of some kind or a peer review editorial board or whatever it is, you should disclose that you have a conflict and recuse yourself from influencing the decision-making of others, but speak only when you're spoken to for the expertise that you bring to the table. So there is a roadmap for trying to deal with this issue, but it requires vigilance on the part of all scientists to exercise these recommendations. The document has about 49 pages of appendices that show the breadth, scope, and growing sophistication of the problem. So if you're going to try to fix a problem, you'd better recognize it first. As I mentioned, if we go back to the 50s and look at medical research, education, and practice, the tobacco industry example, food safety panels in the European Union and North America. In 2015, the network developed its own policy to avoid conflict of interest through donations that it was receiving at the time. And recent epidemiology specific examples were included, and there are 12 of them, A through I, in the document. And these are the 12 examples. I'm not going to go through them. I just wanted you to see that they are more recent, starting in 2016, with the Center for Public Integrity out of Washington, D.C., doing an expose in 2016 of how scientists can be bought, serving on scientific boards, on councils, and review panels. And it's a marvelous piece of investigative journalism. It's thanks to investigative journalism that a lot of this stuff is well known, including the material published by Wade and Frost, I believe it was, in the Halls of Deception. Anyway, there are lots of these kinds of examples. Another very important hot link, what you're hearing, I'm sorry, my cursor doesn't work for me, so I won't touch it. But if you look at the title, A Toolkit of Epidemiology Dirty Tricks, call on us as scientists to recognize the methods. I'm not going to go into them in great depth, but just to show you that the link, you see commentary just published in Environmental Health. I'll show you the article was published. A couple of people on this call actually are acknowledged in it for having helped in contributing to its clarity and certain rounding out of some of the arguments. So environmental health, that is a hot link. And if there is time, I guess I could go back and open the document, but you'll be able to do it at your leisure if you're interested. So what is this document? It just came out on the 19th of August. So it's literally hot off the press. It was deemed so important by the journal Environmental Health that they published a parallel editorial to elevate the attention that would be given to the importance of this piece. And what this piece actually does, well, let me first say it's a compendium of misapplied methods, often demonstrated in legislative activities, and it can be used by peer reviewers as a checklist of what to look out for when they review scientific papers. It can be used, this document, published, as I say, in August, excuse me, to train epidemiologists and others how epidemiology can be distorted, to review the literature for inappropriately conducted science or for uninformative studies, such as a term that we use in our science of underpowered studies, where you just don't have the statistical ability to demonstrate an effect when there truly is an effect. And you may have heard of these things as power or type 1 and type 2 errors in science, and to identify who is misusing or abusing epidemiology. And there are 9 colleagues as co-authors and 3 or 4 people who are acknowledged as having helped so much. The toolkit of this study, of this particular manuscript, contains 33 ways of misusing epidemiology. It's broken, the table is broken into 3 parts. Part A has 18 tools that are used to lie and deceive. Part B is 8 different tools or arguments used to delay action. The first part was specific methods or techniques used to foment uncertainty and cast doubt about cause and effect. And the third part has 7, adding up to 33 different methods or tactics. And this 7 is tactics that are invoked to misdirect policy priorities through influence, imposing undisclosed values from the positions taken by special interests. So going forward, to summarize this critical, simple recommendation, Let's identify when this problem exists, recognize it, identify it, avoid it. If you have the problem, disclose it and recuse yourself from any influence. Now, to bring you up to date on the latest in advancing this topic, one of the recommendations of that January 5th launch of the position statement by INEP, the International Network for Epidemiology and Policy, is to encourage discussion about it, to get other epidemiologists, because me and myself and my 9 co-authors and the people who contributed don't know everything about what's going on in the world. So we see this as hopefully what might be a game changer in shining a light on the problem. So we encourage other people to discuss it and look at it in their local contexts, in their particular subspecialty application areas. But most specifically, where I've been involved, for the International Society for Environmental Epidemiology, and coming up at the end of this month, this is actually going to be my final formal lecture or talk until I've really mastered some of the other things that I'm trying to do, like learn French. The Collegium Ramazzini has or will have hosted a special symposium on the topic that I have organized. I've had the pleasure and honor to have worked with 4 internationally recognized contributors on this topic of conflict of interest and disclosure. One is Juan Pablo Ramos Bonilla from Colombia, Daniel Mandrioli from Italy, Lisa Biro, she was in Sydney when she started helping. She's American, but she worked at the University of Sydney for many years, but she returned to the States about a year ago. And Dr. Carl Craner, also from the USA. He's an environmental lawyer, and the others, Daniel is a toxicologist, and the others are engineers and pharmaceutical experts. Anyway, the specific dimensions that they respectively bring to the topic, which is what I alluded to earlier, is, and I've given their names at the top, conflict of interest and its impact on the research question. And in brief, what Juan Pablo brings to attention is that public funding, this is to set the stage for his concern and the caution that he raises, public funding expended for research has decreased at a global level. An increased number of research institutions and scientists currently rely on corporate funding and its vested interests. It is expected that the current pandemic of COVID will result in more reductions in public funding for research and development in many disciplines. He gives some references at the bottom to that. They're also hot linked. How can this influence the research agenda? And he sees this as a critical issue, in particular in this narrow focus of how we formulate our research questions. And this is what he says about that topic. Corporate funding can influence the research agenda. Seems like a no-brainer with the basis of everything I've already said on this topic to this point. Unless it is recognized by the researcher, identifying if a research question was censored or modified by vested interests is a very difficult thing to do. Past experiences with endocrine disruptors, fossil fuels, asbestos, to name but a few examples, illustrate how corporate funding can drastically affect both the research agenda and public policy. And the question that he is very much focused on is, what are the implications of this for public health? How can this problem be addressed? The next person on the list was Daniel Mandrioli. Sees conflict of interest as a source of bias in epidemiology, and he's done some seminal work in the area. Points to the fact that there is sufficient evidence that it is financial conflicts of interest that are able to affect the outcomes of our studies, whether you find a positive effect or a negative effect in both human and in non-human studies, in many fields, including epidemiology and in toxicology. He points out that financial conflicts of interest introduce bias at all levels of the research and publication process, referring here to author financial ties, review sponsorships, and journal funding. And on the other hand, there is no evidence that the so-called non-financial conflicts of interest, like one's ambitions or other things, constitute a systematic source of bias in research. And again, there are hot links to what the points he's making. And he sums up by saying that systematic reviews and evidence-based methods in epidemiology need to account for financial conflicts of interest when assessing what are called risk of bias and the quality of evidence of the study. He also points out that financial conflicts of interest is already included as an item in the assessment of risk of bias of the navigation guide of the World Health Organization and the International Labour Organization joint methodology for estimating the work-related burden of disease and injury. Just two more of these from the panel that I spoke of on these conferences that were held last month and the one coming up at the end of this month. Most frequently used, Lisa Barrow focuses on what do we actually know about disclosure. We assume that if somebody's given a form and they disclose whether you have a conflict, that they're telling the truth, that they've identified all potential sources of bias that might be influencing their objectivity or their impartiality. So the most frequently used strategy to manage financial conflicts of interest there are frequently used strategies. Current declarations are simply not meaningful. They're poorly accessible, they're inconsistent, they miss information, and there's a lot of obfuscation. And they simply are not enforced. And here is a paper that she published. She's published dozens and dozens of papers on these topics. She's a really highly regarded international expert on the topic. Commercial influence in health, from transparency to independence, improving researchers' conflict of interest declarations is a major area of her concern. And she says, what do we know about disclosure? It does not prevent bias in research. It makes those giving advice more biased and makes readers more critical. It is a necessary requirement, but it is not sufficient to ensure the absence of bias in research. The last one in the panel of four is Carl Craner. This is a lecture in itself, so I'll just give this to you for the sake of completion. Bradford Hill in 1965, for the benefit of those who don't know, published a paper. He's a British biostatistician on what we then took his name as, his name was Austin and his surname was Bradford Hill, the Bradford Hill viewpoints. And this goes back to 1965, and he identified certain of these aspects of studies. He did not call them criteria, and they absolutely discouraged us from ever calling them rigid criteria, but they were aspects to be considered when one was determining the credibility of a study in terms of inferring cause and effect. And these viewpoints have been used by corporate influence to distort science in terrible ways. And Carl Craner has exposed this. In 2011, he produced a book called Legally Poisoned. And as I say, this could be a topic for a lecture in itself. Let me just wrap up by saying non-expert judges have been misled by so-called sound science conferences and testifying industry experts. And Neutra, Craner, and David G. in 2018 published a paper with all the probabilistic analysis that goes into how these aspects are horribly misused to the detriment of public health. So some examples that he gives, demanding that these interests require of science, which is totally contrary to the intent of the Bradford Hill viewpoints, but he's exposed several of these, demanding that epidemiology studies are provided as evidence of adverse health effects. They don't want to change policy if you can demonstrate effects through toxicologic animal studies, for example, or in laboratory petri dishes. They insist on having human evidence. And in fact, they even go so far as to say that if you have human evidence of asbestos effects from South African asbestos miners, well, we'd better repeat those studies in North America to show that the same asbestos will have similar effects demonstrated in South Africa, or vice versa, or lead, or whatever the things are of concern. They require conventional and low statistical significance. So these are just some of the techniques that this paper that I talked about, this toolkit that was published a month ago, brings to attention. And what does Carl Craner finish with? He gives some additional examples showing that epidemiology studies are required to have a relative risk of at least 2. Again, from a Bradford Hill point of view, it's a complete abuse of Bradford Hill's genius. in identifying 9 particular viewpoints or aspects. They demand a biologically plausible mechanism, and only 1 court of 80 in the United States recognize the importance of statistical power in being able to demonstrate effects if they truly are there. So these misuses of epidemiologic studies can become conditions for expert testimony in courts of law in the United States, in Canada too, I presume elsewhere in the world that have the same kind of legal system, preclude relevant scientific evidence, and preclude accurate science. So you can see this is rather important stuff if science is there to protect, is there in the pursuit of truth and to protect the public interest. So to review and leave time for questions and answers, never has truth been under such assault and needed more to protect the public's health. In the document, the position statement that I referred to, there's a nice one of Donald Trump playing some role with his weather forecast meteorologists and getting them to lie about the direction of hurricanes on the topic of climate change. So you can see how political influence can actually cause people to respond in ways that are not consistent with what the data are telling them. Science can be misused. We need to recognize that science can be misused either intentionally through error or from bias. And for centuries, intentional distortion of scientific methods, scientific evidence, and miscommunication of science have been associated with conflict of interest in that Broad Wade book. For example, there's one source. Conflict of interest associated misuse of science can result from self-interest, where you have financial stakes in the game. Just to give you an example, I have colleagues who established their names working for incredibly well-established universities and became incredible scientists, and later in life, some even earlier in life, once they had established some credibility, were bought out, put on retainer by legal firms, some earning up to $20 million a year, to not testify, to say anything that would condemn a particular activity or product, commercial product. So you can see just how serious this is and what the financial stakes are. They are very serious. Others, 2 million a year, but we're talking substantial amounts of money, many more times than most people in North America in the professions would earn in a year. They are paid annually to lie and deceive. And in fact, if you go to that position statement and you look at that one from the Center for Public Integrity in Washington that I talked about, you'll see some wonderful links there of how this actually happened in real time in video form. So they talk about liability protection, political interest, self-advancement, and so on and so forth. And in review, increasing levels of sophistication are being employed that include co-opting regulatory bodies, scientific panels, and communication forums. Journals are being run by these kinds of entities that will publish what we might call, some people would call junk science, but science that certainly is not valid in the ways that the methods ought to be applied. Now, the International Network for Epidemiology and Policy, INEP, recognizes the above and recommends ways to better manage it in the public interest. One of the key points is that we should not be naive. Many of us as scientists, we obsess about clean data, collecting data, drilling down, doing things magnificently cleanly, that we don't even see the wood for the trees sometimes for what's really going on behind the scenes of what gave rise to the very question that we're trying to answer. So we must be aware, even those of us that are profoundly, what would one say, committed and fabulously good scientists, must be aware of the forces at play that influence both science and policy. So great vigilance through organizations like the International Network for Epidemiology and Policy, because not every individual has the capacity to stand up and take on a corporation or take on a government or take on a Trump or take on a whoever. You know, not everybody's built that way, but the organizations can be the front for doing that. Collectively, there can be much more power and credibility in and scrutiny as well of the concern, because not every time somebody complains about something, it's not necessarily that they're right either. So it needs to be impartially examined as an allegation. So great vigilance and personal integrity are required to counter the influence of financially interested parties and corrupt or morally bankrupt governments. This terminology, just by the way, came out of Canadian authors, me being one of them at the time, when they just refused to acknowledge that asbestos needed to be banned. It took from 2007 to about 2018. Now they're actually talking in Quebec, where I now live, of remining or taking to a new industry the extraction of certain products from asbestos, which would again put workers at potential risk of exposure to asbestos and contaminate the environment with it. So it's really a challenge, and we have to be constantly vigilant about monitor what's going on in the world if we're going to protect the public interest. Some key take-home messages in all of this. Uncertainty is inherent to science. We cannot pretend that there's no uncertainty. In fact, the scientific method is designed that you do a study at the 95% level. The type 1 and type 2 errors are defined that way, which means that 5% of the time that you could actually be wrong, just on the basis of probabilities. But that's how science is done. And that's why it's not just one scientific study that demonstrates an effect. Usually it has to be replicated in different communities by different methodologies and so on. Now, this is where it becomes very critical in terms of conflict of interest and recusal and recognizing the problem. While science strives to be value neutral or value free, the human instrument is incapable of these things. We as people cannot be value free or neutral on a topic. We all have some bias, and it's the scientific enterprise that is meant to keep us all as impartial as possible in the scheme of things. So then the point that I make is to look first to ourselves, because when we try to infer causality from some chemical that we think might be causing an effect, or some product that we might think is causing harm, it's a function of who it is that is making the inference, which in turn is a function of how we apply our scientific methods. So it brings me back to the title of the talk today, which is interests. And I think I'd like to believe that I've exposed for you here how and why this is motivated and how it can occur. And in my final slide, I mentioned at the beginning, if you do have questions, to go to the chat box. Jolene has access to this presentation. So if there are questions that require opening up at a certain page, perhaps Jolene, you could do that if you want to open up that toolkit, if somebody wants to see that level of detail. But I would like to believe that there'll be enough Q&A that people can look at it on their own. And feel free, if you want to ask me questions directly, I have an email address shown at the bottom of this slide. And this, as I mentioned at the beginning, this particular presentation will be put onto my website, and Jolene is recording it, and we'll put the recording up on mine as well. So thank you very much, everyone, for your attention. Jolene, are you there? You're on mute, Jolene.
Thank you so much, Colin. I had myself on mute. Michael, would you like to look at the chat box? Otherwise,
Jolene, I'm going to stop sharing now so that I can see you all.
Sure.
Oh, great. Okay. Oh, okay. There's you. Mark, you're still with us. We didn't lose you. Good.
No. So Mark had a question. Mark, do you just want to ask your question to Colin directly? Mark?
Sure. I got some battery left. I'm out here right now. I use my phone battery, so I'll just make it quick. I was just looking at the slide where one of the women, I think, that you worked with, she had like 5 criterion of what's missing in COIs, conflict of interest statements. And I'm wondering, okay, well, we know what to do, but how long will it take to do what, like, just to satisfy these 5 things? And she said, there's lots of obfuscatory, like language that obfuscates very simple things. But even though they're so simple, will it take years to implement these 5 things? Will it take months, days? Like, how long are we talking here? And is it meaningful for the rate that these corporate interests are invading on public interest?
Okay, good question, Mark. We're always concerned about the urgency of the seriousness and the associated urgency of seeing some way of fixing this mess. But unfortunately, the answer that I have for your question is that it's an ongoing process. There will always be people who think in terms of their own self-preservation, and there will be the need, therefore, for people to be vigilant. As I said in the final slides, organizations like the International Network for Epidemiology and Policy should always be there, keeping their finger on the pulse of how long it's taking for people to rectify examples or to correct examples of malfeasance when they are seen to occur. Okay. So unfortunately, I see it as going on indefinitely, Mark, not something that can be fixed promptly.
Maybe I'll just add something quickly. Sorry, I'm just jumping in. I mean, just in terms of these 5 criteria, it's very specific. So these ones shouldn't be ongoing. It should be like kind of clear, at least for 5 things. My friend invented an app that is replacing entire legal firms in like the accident industry. And he got into an accident. It took him like a year or 2 to get any insurance claims. So he just mapped out the entire process and then cut out all the bureaucracy and like went straight. Well, he implemented algorithms and he was able to do the same thing, which takes years, in literally 2 months for people. And I'm wondering, is there a realistic way to do that for public health and what we're talking about here?
Well, Mark, in fact, I'm hoping that you might find yourself admitted to a graduate program and take it on as a PhD topic. But that's the level of focus and attention that it's going to require. And maybe the University of Alberta would consider you if others overseas won't. So whatever, there should be a place for you, I would like to believe.
Colin,
I see another question.
Yeah, there's a question from Mangi, and we've got Melanie Alperstein attending, and Melanie has very vast experience in the public health sphere in South Africa. So I hope that Melanie is going to engage with you. My son Carl sat and watched. He was very interested in your presentation, and he kept saying, "I want to hear what Mel has to say." So she's because Melanie does such important work, and I think really resonates with what you're doing and your ethos. So Mangi says, thank you, Colin. Can you tell us a bit about how peer review controls free scientists feel about speaking up when they see corruption in their field? Can I reread that to you?
No, I'm reading it, and it's okay. So
thank you, Mangi.
Yeah, thanks for the question. A good question too. Scientists are often very afraid to speak up for fear of reprisals, for fear of losing their jobs. But that's, I would like to believe, is exceptional. Some of the studies, the sociological studies that have been done to address that question would seem to suggest that it's a very small percentage. Most people will stand up and be supported. I, for example, had that problem in when did I do my PhD? In 1981, 82, 83, where I was funded by the Exxon Corporation in the United States, found a very positive effect. And Jolene mentioned it in the introductory remarks about me. I found that I, through perhaps naivety, just didn't realize what I was taking on, where Exxon was pushing back and trying to suppress my finding. I just persisted, and they really wanted me to go away and for the study to never see the light of day. But eventually it won an award for the best PhD thesis in 1983, and it became the lead article in the American Journal of Epidemiology. And 10 years later, you ask how long things take, Mark. 10 years later, it was part of the parcel of evidence considered by the International Agency for Research on Cancer, because other studies had been done to replicate the work I had done, which was an essential few steps scientifically to demonstrate effect. And indeed, it was then demonstrated clearly that, or they decided that it was indeed a definitive human carcinogen, what they call a group 1 carcinogen. And that was what was very interesting from a career point of view for me. It was very elevating, because advancing of my own career, because it was the first time that a mixture of chemicals, not just a one chemical, one health effect at a time study, which is what's normally done, but where a whole mixture without animal studies. You can't do animal studies with acids because they die. Expose them to acids, they pack up. You can't follow them to a logical endpoint. So just on the basis of human data, this definitive decision was made that it was a definitive carcinogen. So one has to have inordinate patience with science to be respectful of the methods and the procedure for advancing it, recognizing that there will always be, there always have been, as the book by Broad and Wade demonstrates, from Newton to Galileo, to where people have just manipulated, truncated data, left out extreme data points. They just don't get it somehow. They never got it right, but now we understand it. And this August 19th paper highlights some of it as it relates to public health. Okay, does that answer your question, Manji? Duplexus?
Yeah. That was very good. Thank you, Colin.
Thank you. Right. Melanie Alperstein, do you have anything with all your experience in public health? Do you have any comments or insights on what Colin has so eloquently presented tonight?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think the whole thing of the vested interests of the corporates are a huge issue. And I think the very topical one at the moment, and Colin, I'd love to hear your view on this, is the science behind the vaccines and the treatment for COVID. Because there are quite a few, I mean, the one in particular, now the name of the drug's going to slip my mind, but the one, yeah, probably ivermectin. And then the new one that seems to be good for treatment, but the costs that the big pharma are putting on it are like way. But I'd love to hear your view on the balance of the science and the you know, the kind of what do you call it? Almost, yeah, the urgency of people having vaccines, but also the whole issue of the booster. Two issues around that. One is we know that in like the continent of Africa, about 1 to 2%, 2 to 3% of the population has been vaccinated in the whole of Africa. South Africa's probably done the most vaccines, but I don't think we are higher than 10% if we've even reached there. And then the science behind the boosters, how much evidence is that for it when there are populations that have not even had one vaccine? Yeah, I'd just love to hear your views on and how much I mean, if you take the Oxford AstraZeneca, Oxford was willing to have the cost at cost price, but AstraZeneca is a big pharma company, raised the price, and yeah, just all of those issues.
Yeah, okay, I'll have a go at that.
Okay.
I don't want to sidestep the question because they're good questions and I'll do my best to answer them. But I do want to disclose that when Jolene will remember this well, when I saw her when I was last in Cape Town a year and a half ago, right before I had to leave prematurely back to Canada, I said to her, this is a serious pandemic. We're going to see a lot of death. It's going to be a big problem. But at this stage of my career, I am not going to get involved in anything to do with COVID other than as it relates to me as a citizen. So I have not been keeping up with the literature. I've been rather more intent on finishing up all these other loose ends that I wanted to complete before I fully retire, which I'm now in the process. At the end of October, it will be in place. So, but to answer your question, there are so many, there's so much disinformation and misinformation out there. I would be inclined to dismiss it with, in many cases, the contempt that it deserves. People are mischievous. They do it for reasons unbeknownst. I mean, each one has to be considered in its own context, I'm sure. And perhaps I will be, I hope, in South Africa later in November. I've just booked my tickets this week. I should be arriving on the 22nd of November. So hopefully, Jolene, I can get to meet some of these good people that have been around, with Jolene sponsoring some milk tart or something. But anyway, so with regard to the drug trials, I think that the views that these big pharma companies are out to make a killing in all of this is an absurdity. Who else is going to do it? Are we forgetting that we're all alive today thanks to polio vaccines, thanks to smallpox vaccines? And for those of us that are older, thanks to shingles vaccines, we're not getting shingles. Thanks to measles, mumps, rubella, the grandchildren are growing up well. And it's thanks to that kind of research that's being done. Now, it may prove to be that it was, that we are all living through a human experiment at the moment where the whole world is being inoculated. And goodness knows what the long-term consequences of it will be. But you have to, from a public health point of view, from where I sit, you've got to weigh up the disadvantage compared to the advantage. If you look at the current spikes in the pandemic, they're occurring among essentially unvaccinated people. So we've simply got to get everybody vaccinated before this virus continues its mutations and comes back to haunt us with some other strain for which the vaccines may not work. But fortunately, the platforms for developing the vaccine, I understand, were in development for many years, many decades, but more specifically the past 20 years. And this work is phenomenal. It's allowed the technology to develop. Now, should there be unlimited greed on the part of pharmaceutical companies, I'm not in a position to say that they're making AstraZeneca would have, been much more fair in terms of minimizing profits. But when you think about the investment in research that goes into the development of drugs, I mean, I'm the last person in the world to be speaking in support of industrial decency and sanity, but there are incredibly good corporations in this world that have done unbelievable good. It's not all corporations. So it's a question of who's running it, who's at the head, what the shareholders are expecting at the time. So I'm, as I say, I don't want to sidestep your question, but maybe we can have face-to-face on it in person. By which time, once I've retired, I'll have more time to study what's going on with COVID. But I read, part of the reason is, I'm not sure if you're aware, but if you look at my website, I was one of the lead people in Canada in 1982, 83, 84, well, through 89, 82 through 89, when AIDS first hit. And having lived through being a public health professional at the time of AIDS, trust me, I never want to work in another epidemic situation. It's just not rewarding. It's not fun. I mean, there are many people, I'm sure, that are alive today thanks to the public education or the professional education that I, as a public health professional, offered at the time. But it was exhausting. It's just draining beyond belief, dealing with There's some. I should have put a wonderful cartoon that I got. Let me just read you what it says. It looks like two people going to share their religious perspective with in a neighborhood, and it's probably United States based. But just let me read it to you, because otherwise I'll mess it up. I'll get these wonderful things from time to time. Here it is. So maybe I can actually show it to you. See, it's this couple at the door, and there's a guy in his looking very comfortable at home. And at the bottom it says, "Hi there, we're in the neighborhood peddling conspiracy theories, and we're hoping you're an idiot."
Yeah, no. I mean,
there's a whole lot. There's this one. You know, you've heard of the 4 horses of the apocalypse, right? Well, here's the four horses. The one is war, famine, pestilence, and death. And the one that says death is looking at the one on the other side and saying, "And you are?" And that one says misinformation. You know, this is apocalyptic, the way.
Yeah.
Anyway, there's a whole bunch of them. They're brilliant.
Yes. No, I mean, I'm all for the vaccine. I think it's more around, you know, have we been in the pandemic long enough? We know that the vaccine works, and we know that, you know, you need the 2 doses of certain vaccines, 1 of another, etc., etc. But I suppose it's questioning the inequity in the world, and
Absolutely.
the richer countries going for boosters when we don't actually have enough science, I don't think, to say you need a booster after the original.
No. I will. From what I've read as a member of the public, absolutely, there's enough evidence that immunity wanes after about 6 to 8 months, and one therefore should have a booster. It's akin to the shingles vaccine, this newest one called Shingrix, I think, where you get the 1 shot, and within 3 to 6 months you've got to get a 2nd shot. And I don't know whether they're following up, but soon they might come out and say, well, you'd better get a 3rd shot. And of course, those of us that have had enough experience to be cynical about you know, why are they doing this? Well, of course, they're going to make money doing it. But I believe that one can trust the science when it goes through the FDA process and through people like Anthony Fauci, who, you know, I've heard people say terrible things about, but I don't see him in that light at all.
No, absolutely. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. Sorry, carry on, Mo.
No, but I was just going to say, in general, though, the more corporates fund and public funding goes down, the more I think we will see skewed research.
Well, absolutely, Melanie. In fact, in 1940, around the time of the Second World War, the American Association for the Advancement of Science alerted the American public and the world through the journal Science, or the magazine Science, that with more scientific questions needing to be asked and less public funding being available to address those questions, the private sector was going to come in and be funding more and more research, and they warned against exactly what you're saying. So this is not a new concern. This is something that's been going on for about 70 years so far. And absolutely, it's manifesting in all kinds of ways to be shown to be correct, that we have good reason to be concerned.
Thank you, Melanie and Colin, and we will get together when Colin comes round. Nazir Sonde has his hand up.
Thank you. Thank you, Jolene. So I came on a bit later. I apologize for that. And while Colin was talking, I thought to myself, man, is this a conspiracy theorist of note, or what's going on here?
Of me as a conspiracy theorist.
Yes. You know, and of course, as your presentation went on and on, I soon realized, but it was not. You know, your position is really about, you know, actually mistrusting of corporations, in science in the hands of corporations. And then Melanie, of course, came and asked the very next thing that was in my mind about the vaccinations. Okay, so you don't want to commit too much to it, but you said enough. Yes. But I want to also thirdly share with you some information around agriculture. You see, because in agriculture, well, I think you have, Colin, already referred to Jeffrey Smith's work, The Seeds of Deception.
Sorry, to
but
whose
there's
work?
a lot of other work.
Jeffrey Sachs,
Yes.
did you say? Oh,
Sorry,
yes. In fact, Mark
Sachs,
knows
yes.
Jeffrey Sachs personally.
Yes. That book was an amazing book, which I got and read early on in this whole discussion around GMOs in the early 90s when it hit South Africa here. And but lately, as I've developed my journey into understanding agriculture and my role in agriculture as a small-scale farmer, I also came across some interesting signs and issues that cast aspersions on scientists that are talking about the impact of fertilizers on the environment and human health, pesticides, herbicides, and so on, right? And one that I want to share with you guys in particular is from Dr. Jonathan Lundgren, 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 Jonathan Lundgren. Jonathan Lundgren was a very interesting fellow. He worked for the United States Department of Agriculture, and he was a scientist, and he supervised many studies. But he fell foul of the USDA when his own research into the impact of glyphosate on pollinators, bees especially, became problematic. And his research showed that the bee colony disorder was as a result of glyphosate, the heavy use of glyphosate across the United States, and the death of bees was as a result of that. And he was then his whole character was maligned in the department. He was accused of having a sexually harassing a work colleague. He was maligned, and he was suspended. And he wanted to defend his work and himself, but decided, you know what, this is going to be a sideshow, which is going to actually remove the impact of his work. And so he resigned from USDA. But he mentioned three things which and how the science is manipulated, which you obviously would know, Colin. And it started really with the tobacco industry. They became a master of manipulation, according to him. So the first thing they do is they obscure the inconvenient studies. They obscure the studies. Then they find a preponderance of supportive evidence. And thirdly, they discredit and intimidate the inconvenient scientists. And that seemed to be, exactly what confirmed what you are saying about the manipulation of science, Colin. And then the other thing I wanted to just mention is that there is a documentary which I haven't seen yet, but I should really see it. It's called Naomi. It's by Naomi Oreskles. Merchants of Doubt.
It's in one of my slides, Nazir. It's Merchants of Doubt, right?
Yes.
Have you seen it?
No. I actually when I'm sitting in your class, it made me understand. I got to take a very closer look at these documentaries and put some more thinking, empower myself with more information around the issue. Yeah, so I just wanted to contribute that in with regards to food and food safety and food health and environmental health and how the science is manipulated. This is a really important public issue. It made me become an organic farmer, a small scale farmer. In my area, I am referred to by the big farmers as Kreva Boer. Kreva Boer, yeah. And I farm with weeds. I think that's all I wanted to say. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. Well, I'll look forward to meeting you at the end of the year as well.
Thank you very much, Colin. I wanted to ask Warren Hurt if he had a comment. He looked very interested.
Actually, I don't. I think the information was pretty clear, and it was a good eye-opener for me. Thank you, Colin.
Thanks for being there, Warren.
Thank you. Michael, do you have a comment or question?
Just one quick comment. I think that was really a brilliant talk, Colin. Thanks very much. I think the problems that you've raised, while your focus was specifically on public health, it's actually a universal problem. It goes way beyond public health through to health and medicine in general and business in general. And the second comment is, firms do invest in research, but particularly in the States, they benefit hugely from public investment in research. All the big companies, Apple, Google, all the big pharmaceutical companies rely very heavily on advances made in publicly funded research. And that includes the vaccines for COVID. And the drug companies don't pay back the debt that they really should acknowledge to the investment of the public in basic science.
Correct. Because I think government would rationalize it as saying, well, they pay tax, but then we've seen so much exposed for escaping tax requirements. Absolutely.
That's Emil in his face. Thank you, Michael. Thanks,
Michael. Michael's a very harsh critic, so I'm grateful that he found it a coherent whole message. Thanks, Michael. I'm relieved. I was thinking of you every time I dotted I's and crossed T's. I thought, would Michael approve? Thanks. I just wanted to say to Nazir, I've published quite a bit. I did not develop this context, this paradigm, but if you Google the 4 Ds, the letter D of the alphabet, the 4 Ds, you'll find that there's sometimes 10 Ds, 11 Ds, but the 4 Ds is the one that I've often published about, which talks about deny. So when you find when there's a positive study that shows an ill effect, the people who have a vested interest in squashing what you say or they'll deny what you say, they'll try to cause delays so that they can keep reporting positive results to shareholders at the end of every quarter or every year. And if it's a politician, so that they can be re-elected 4 years later. So they'll do anything to remain in control. So to delay things from happening, no change, no investment in change to make things better. And then what they'll do is, if that's not working, they'll divide. They'll actually find scientists to do bad science so that they divide scientific opinion. The bad science will show, using tobacco, oh, tobacco is actually good for you. Other scientists, the main publicly funded scientists will say tobacco is bad for you, but it causes stir and division because science by its very nature is a conservative machine that moves forward and advances one step of knowledge at a time. So you've got to verify and reaffirm and correct and self-correcting process that you have to go through. And then finally, if you prevail at the end of the day, you've overcome their denial, you've overcome their delay tactics, you've overcome their attempts to divide scientists. They'll then, as you said, try to discredit you, and they will malign you, and they will do terrible things to you. I had all of these things happen to me when I did my doctoral, when I'd left South Africa, did my doctoral study in Philadelphia at the University of Pennsylvania, funded by Exxon, and that's exactly what I went through. So I have personal experience of having been through that process. And I've published about 3 papers on the very topic. And so you can read somewhat sanitized. I mean, when we meet, I can give you the real background scoop on it if you want, the parts that are more sanitized than others for publication purposes. No, but they don't hide anything. They speak very openly. And I've got book chapters and books that speak about the 4 Ds. So I think, Nazir, you'll find that very insightful. Just Googling 4 Ds and seeing just how well established this is as a tactic, unfortunately.
Okay, we've actually reached 8:30 in South Africa, so it is 3 p.m. in the States. Am I right?
2:30.
2:30. Oh, 2:30 we started. Okay. So are there any last questions?
We will be having the panel discussion at the end of, on the 17th of October, and I plan to be part of it. And hopefully most of the speakers will be back, and we'll see what we've learned from all of this conversation.
Okay. So
thank you so much, everybody, for taking
Colin.
the time to
It's
join
amazing.
us. Thank you.
Thank you.